Hey guys, I figured out the self-destruct code sequence. It still doesn't do anything because nothing in this rust bucket works, but hey, it was worth a shot.
I don't have anything. I've woken up and worse. Warning, do not play in or around dumpster. Do not kick dumpster. Do not sleep in dumpster. Usage of this container for disposal of human remains may be a violation of local health ordinances. I don't have anything. Take that. And that.
Yep, we're finally, after 143 episodes, taking a look at a LucasArts adventure title, specifically Full Throttle. While a lot of people are highly critical of this game, most of that criticism comes from the fact that, as far as LucasArts adventure games are concerned, this one doesn't live up to the kinds of expectations and standards set by their other titles. But let's be honest here, this is still a really good game despite that, and so I think people are often much harder on this game than they really should be, given the other adventure titles it was competing against. Now, that doesn't make Full Throttle a perfect game by any means. For one thing, it's actually one of the shortest adventure games I've ever played. If you know exactly what to do and skip all of the cutscenes, you could probably speedrun this thing in under half an hour. And even with virtually no idea how to get through some of the puzzles and combat sections, and watching all the cutscenes, I went from start to finish in just 4 hours of gameplay. I think a good way to describe this game is short and sweet, because even though the story is a bit ridiculous, it was still enjoyable, and unlike a lot of games from the 90s, the voice acting here is really good and helps to get the player interested in what's going on. On top of this is some excellent music, great sound effects, a unique hybrid art style combining hand-drawn animation and 3D CGI that's actually surprisingly appealing. This game is just a fun time the whole way through, even when you're making mistakes and dealing with some of the awkward control and combat mechanics, which thankfully don't really affect things all that much, and those are never a hindrance to the experience.
You have a last name?
I prefer not to use it. What about you?
Same deal.
Then it's Ben and Mo forever, I guess.
Full Throttle was developed and released by LucasArts in 1995 and is a one-player, inventory-based adventure game. It uses VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, and in terms of audio, supports Sound Blaster cards, Pro Audio Spectrum cards, the Gravis Ultrasound, and the Ensoniq Soundscape. As for its current release date, it's still commercial, and while there's been no digital release as far as I can tell, you can find copies on places like Amazon and eBay very easily, with a disc alone going for $5 to $10, and fully boxed copies going for around $20 to $30. I have a couple notes though about buying a physical copy. The first is that there's apparently a disc out there that has both Full Throttle and Star Wars Dark Forces together on it. But I don't know much about this disc, and I can't figure out if they're the full games or just demo versions. So if you're looking to play and not to collect, you should probably just go for a regular copy of the game. Speaking of that though, there's also macOS and Windows versions of the game out there, but it can be tricky to tell which one you're getting. And just remember that if you happen to get a copy that won't run natively on your system, DOSBox isn't your only option, as the ScumVM emulator I've talked about before simply needs access to the game's data files and it's good to go. Thus, any version of the game itself should run with that emulator regardless of your modern operating system of choice. Also, I should point out that the copy I have is indeed the Windows version, but it comes with all of the files necessary to run it straight from DOS. save for the installer. So if you want to run the Windows copy on a DOS system or in DOSBox, then check out the additional information section below this video on my website, as I'll have some detailed instructions on how to pull this off, since if you don't do it right, you won't be able to save your game properly.
What could possibly be taking so long?
Maybe old man Corley got himself in trouble.
Yeah, maybe they took the old guy out back and worked him over with a 2x4.
An appealing notion, but improbable. More likely he's boring them to death with some tale of the glory days.
But Malcolm, isn't that illegal?
Not back then it wasn't.
Even though you'd think a game centered around bikers would take place in the present, this game actually takes place quite some time in the future, where motorbikes aren't exactly that common a thing anymore, as most people have switched to using hovering vehicles. In fact, in this future, there's only a single company left making any motorbikes at all, Corley Motors. The game opens with Malcolm Corley and his right-hand man, Adrian Ripburger, traveling out to a particular biker hangout known as the Kickstand to find the Polecats, one of the two major biker gangs of the area. When they get to the Kickstand, we discover pretty quickly that Corley has quite the good reputation, thanks to his earlier days as a biker, and, being the head of the only company still making motorbikes. But Ripburger wants to get right to the point, as he has his own agenda. He pulls the leader of the Polecats, known simply as Ben, out back to discuss the deal. But Ben refuses, since the Polecats are not just a bunch of thugs for rent. Ripburger then makes Ben a second offer, this time at the end of a 2x4. After Ripburger lures the rest of the Polecats away from the Kickstand, Ben wakes up a while later in a dumpster. Following his escape, he starts trying to figure out what's going on and how to deal with the situation, thus beginning a rather short but ridiculous journey of lies, deceit, and kicking things.
Seem to have a lot of time on your hands, not to mention nicks and scratches. Am I distracting you?
The gameplay here is incredibly straightforward, and the interface is entirely mouse-driven. There are some keyboard controls you can use, but for the most part, they're unnecessary. You simply left-click on spots you want Ben to move to, right-click to access your inventory, and if you want to perform an action on something, simply hold the left mouse button down to access your action menu, which has 4 actions available: eyes, mouth, hand, and foot, which are respectively used to look at things, talk to things, grab things, and kick things. Actually, funny thing about these actions is that quite a number of the objects you encounter can indeed be kicked, even though most of the time just get a funny line of dialogue in the process. Though you do use your feet to knock down a couple of doors as you progress through. As for the inventory, there's surprisingly few inventory items in this game, and each time you get past a certain section, you'll often enter the next with few, if any, of the items you previously had. To that end, the game's more driven by its different sections, with each section being essentially a different area you have access to after losing access to the previous area. Now, one thing I should definitely make note of right now is that, unlike a lot of adventure titles, there's no way to die in this game. One of the tropes of adventure titles in general is the notion of walking dead, basically being in a game state where you absolutely cannot win because you've messed up the required sequence of events. Yet the game is still playing and you can still do stuff. Walking Dead scenarios are one of the most aggravating things that can happen in any game, regardless of genre. But Full Throttle is a game where you can't die. And since you can't die, this means it's incredibly important for there to be no way to break the normal sequence of events. Otherwise, you just end up in limbo forever. This is part of the reason why your inventory items aren't really kept between different parts of the game, since having useless items present would add to player frustration when trying to solve puzzles, and might worry the player regarding if they've missed something earlier in. I say you can't die, but the truth is there are some time-limited events at the end of the game which will kill you. But when they do, you just get sent back a little, so it's not like the game's going to try and punish you by making you do entire sections all over again or anything like that. With all this in mind, though, it's probably a good idea to mention that there's a particular problem with the mouse interface that's kinda annoying. Normally in a point-and-click adventure title, when you highlight something that can be interacted with the cursor, it will change in some way to indicate this. And yes, the cursor does indeed change in this game, but with a half-second delay. So long as you already know what you're trying to click on, this is a non-issue. But one of the things that often happens when you're playing a point-and-click adventure is you'll run the mouse all over the screen to see what can and can't be interacted with. But because there's such a huge delay between pointing at something and getting an indication that it can be interacted with, you'll often end up moving the mouse around, seeing the highlight appear, stop moving the cursor where you think that highlight is supposed to be, but then the highlight disappears because you've actually passed over the object and are no longer pointing at it. Well, this can be pretty annoying. It's thankfully just a minor issue, since once you know where to click, this doesn't really matter anymore. It's just something to keep in mind. Another thing that happens in this game too is combat. Now, there's actually two major combat sections you'll go through, one on your bike and a Demolition Derby. Now, the combat is one aspect of the game people often criticize as being far too simple, repetitive, and gimmicky. Well, firstly, it's not really all that gimmicky. In fact, it's really straightforward. Simple isn't technically a bad thing either. Repetitive, give him that. The bike combat sequence basically has you riding through a valley road looking for other bikers to beat up. The idea when going through this sequence is to build up your weapons to the point where you can attack a very specific target successfully in order to steal a special pair of electronic goggles. Now you do this by attacking other bikers, because when you win combat against them, you get their weapon of choice. Now, each weapon in this sequence has three major attributes: its damage, its range, and its attack speed. Combat essentially just comes down to doing enough damage to knock your opponent down before your opponent does the same to you. Though if you do get knocked down, you just get right back up and keep on riding. So yeah, the combat is dead simple and has zero strategy, but it plays well enough considering, especially since each fight typically goes by really fast. And if you end up in a fight that isn't going to help you out, you can just skip it by pressing the escape key. Pressing escape also skips you ahead while on the road, and in the regular gameplay, the escape key skips cutscenes. The other combat section in this game is a Demolition Derby near the end. This thing is a bit tricky to figure out, as the goal is to ram your vehicle into a friend's vehicle to stage a spectacular accident. But in order to get to your friend's vehicle, you first have to get past another that's doing an extremely good job of keeping you away. Now, the controls here are sort of acceleration based, where you move the mouse to accelerate turning side to side and press the mouse buttons to accelerate forwards and backwards. It's extremely awkward to play, and I was actually running into technical issues trying to get past it. Though I kind of lucked out at one point because my car glitched up into a corner rather rapidly, allowing me to completely bypass the car that was keeping me at bay. So while the bike-based combat is okay, the Demolition Derby feels like a rushed afterthought in terms of gameplay and is probably the most forgettable sequence in the entire game. Thus, I'm not really doing you all a hindrance by spoiling the fact that it's here. Just consider yourself warned that for every section of the game that plays really well, this is the one section which doesn't. I really thought this would be a longer episode, but I'm already out of stuff to really talk about with this game. Probably a testament to just how short it is. While Full Throttle isn't very long at all and has some minor annoyances, the overall presentation is superb for what it is, making it a great title to play for anyone into inventory-based adventure games. Actually, even if this isn't typically your genre of choice, the short length and simpler puzzle design may make it more appealing than you might imagine. So those of you just into old DOS titles in general may still get a kick out of this thing, especially if you have any interest at all in biker culture. Me personally, I only know a little, but what little I know lets me understand why some people find it highly appealing. And this game does a great job of setting the tone and keeping it going, despite how ludicrous the story can get at times. All in all, just a fun little adventure title.
It's a single hoverlift unit.
As for setting this game up in DOSBox, just leave cycle set to auto and you're good to go. The game has some very rudimentary copy protection by checking for disk label and directory structures, so if you intend to play it on real hardware, you will need the real CD handy, but with DOSBox, you can just copy the directory data to a folder and mount it as a pretend CD drive with the proper labeling. Or you can just feed the game's data files to ScumVM and completely bypass all that. Again, you can check out the video page on my website if you need more help setting this up with DOSBox. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 144 will be on Saturday, August 2nd, and I'll be taking a look at a platformer that has lots of giant mushrooms right in the very first level. Well, at least in the background. If you know which games like that, then send your guests to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned as we check out a game that's actually incredibly nostalgic for me despite its simplicity.